Hey guys, welcome back. Welcome to quarter four. You'll notice I'm standing in front of a blank background, and the reason for this is that right now everybody's got 100 in my class and in every class. So our hope is that you hold on to that 100, and it's our job to help get you there. So we're going to pick up where we left off last quarter, which was talking about the Great Depression, and we are going to look at some statistics before we get started about what is going on right now. There's a saying, may you live in interesting times, and we are definitely in it. Economists are in agreement that what we're dealing with right now is the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and that's global, not just in the United States. In the US, they're estimating that unemployment is going to be at about 17% by the end of this month. That's almost to the 25%. That's the historic high in 1932 in the middle of the Great Depression. And it's only taken us about 6 weeks to reach this point. So it's truly unprecedented what's happening right now. And just to show you guys really how stark these numbers are, we're going to take a look at this graph right here. The last time we had some serious unemployment was in 2009 during the Great Recession. At that point, unemployment peaked at 665,000. And just the other day, the New York Times reported there have been 22 million Americans have filed for unemployment. So this is really a historic moment in our country and in the world. So what has the federal government done in response to all this? On March 27th, Congress passed the largest spending bill in the history of the United States. This is a historic spending bill, $2 trillion. That's T as in trillion dollars. And this bill is going to go for a number of things. $1,200 to every American earning under $75,000. Small business loans, $500 billion to corporations that have been hurt by the pandemic, and aid for hospitals and workers fighting the coronavirus. Now you might ask, why is the government spending so much money on this? This is a huge spending bill. And there actually were some lawmakers who raised questions about it, but very few. Most Americans, most lawmakers, most economists say, we gotta do this. And part of the reason they say this is because we've learned our lessons from the Great Depression. It goes back to the 1930s when the government actually didn't do very much at the beginning of the Depression, and Americans did not respond positively to that. We're going to look at that story today. The star of our story is someone named Herbert Hoover. And Hoover famously said in 1930, economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement. Before we do anything though, I'd like you to stop this video and I would like you to answer question one. What's one statistic that jumped out at you about the seriousness of the current economic situation that we are dealing with? Okay, welcome back guys. So you can join me at the top of the reading. I'm going to read the first paragraph and you can just follow along on the reading that's on Google Classroom. By 1932, the U.S. economy had hit rock bottom, and evidence of the worst economic downturn in the nation's history was everywhere. 2 million homeless people wandered across the country in search of food, a job, or a helping hand. People waited in bread lines that wrapped around city blocks. Children went to school distracted by empty bellies, and unemployed workers congregated at locked factory gates. Black clouds of dust smothered the Midwest, as drought destroyed crops and left farmers destitute. Americans were uncertain and divided over how to deal with the economic crisis. Some wanted drastic action and radical reform. 25,000 people gathered in Union Square in New York City to listen to communist speakers. The communists advocated overturning the capitalist system, giving workers control over the means of production, eliminating extreme wealth, and leveling American society. In Washington, D.C., several thousand men, women, and children greeted Congresspeople upon their return to session in 1932 with shouts of "Tax the rich, feed the hungry." So I'd like you to read the next paragraph on your own and answer questions 2 and 3. Why was President Herbert Hoover hesitant to give direct aid to Americans during the Depression? And do you agree with him on this? What's your take? So Hoover was concerned about the federal government giving money to people in need. And it wasn't because he was an uncaring person, but he was concerned that this would build a kind of dependence on the government for help. It kind of comes down to this question right here. Should the government help out people who are struggling? And to what degree? How much help? For how long? This is still a debate as Americans that we are having. And we've been having since the Great Depression. So I'd like you to read the next paragraph independently and answer the question, what steps did Hoover take to deal with the Depression? So Hoover did a number of things. He did give loans to businesses, and the idea was that this was going to trickle down over time, eventually, someday. For a lot of Americans, this didn't really make them feel like something was being done quickly. He did start some public works projects. There were some government jobs that helped people get back to work, but this was done on a very minimal scale. What he did not do was give direct aid to the poor or the unemployed. I'm going to read the last paragraph to you guys, and then you can answer question 5.
To many desperate Americans, Hoover often appeared cold and uncaring. As conditions worsened, they began to blame him for causing the Depression. Homeless settlements with dwellings made of discarded plywood and corrugated metal were dubbed Hoovervilles, and empty pockets pulled inside out were called Hoover flags to reflect the public's view that Hoover was unable to turn the economy around. However, in addition to Hoover, many economists and astute businessmen were surprised by the severity of the Depression. To his credit, some of Hoover's solutions, like increased spending on public works, were expanded with success in the years after Hoover was voted out of office. So, as we just read, Americans started to blame President Herbert Hoover for the worst effects of the Depression. A lot of people felt like he wasn't doing enough. And this feeling reached an all-time high in 1932 with an event called the Bonus Army March. Now, you guys are going to watch a video about this. I'm going to ask you to answer questions 6, 7, and 8 while you watch the video. And then you can come back here for one last check-in. And we'll see you soon.
In the spring of 1932, an army of the unemployed rolled across the United States toward Washington, D.C. Within months, they would threaten Herbert Hoover's political future and would shake the faith of many Americans in their government. It all began when ex-Army Sergeant Walter W. Waters led 300 veterans out of Portland, Oregon. Their goal? To claim a bonus for service in World War I. Congress had promised to pay the bonus in 1945, but the veterans wanted their money now. With increasing numbers of veterans hopping freight trains to Washington, confrontations along the way began to make national news. Other veterans, hearing of the bonus army, also began moving toward the capital.
Father came home one day and said to my mother, pack up the kids, we're going to Washington, D.C. for the bonus army.
One nation, with liberty, and justice for all.
My uncle Sam was the first in our family to ever go east to the nation's capital because he felt compelled to see that the bonus was paid off.
If there was a bonus army going to Washington, D.C., my dad wouldn't miss it for the world. He was very anti the Hoover administration and the trickle-down economy of that particular era. It was an adventure. We all got in the trucks and we would drive to the outskirts of town. We'd get out of the trucks and then we would march through the town with our signs and so forth. And my brother and I and several other children, we held a large American flag in our hands, spread out like a spread. And as we marched through the townspeople threw nickels and dimes into the flag. And That was the funding for food and gasoline.
Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee Doodle-Dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was a kid with a drum.
The president and many in Congress attempted to discourage the bonus movement, but the veterans kept coming.
Say, don't you remember?
By the time they arrived in Washington, the entire nation knew about the bonus army. Unlike other protesters who marched on Washington and then went home, the veterans promised to camp out in the city until a new bonus bill was signed into law. Washington's police chief, Pelham Glassford, housed the first arrivals in abandoned buildings along Pennsylvania Avenue, just a few blocks from Capitol Hill. But as homeless men and their families continued to pour in, the police chief sent them outside the city, to the mud flats along the Anacostia River. In case of riot, Glassford knew he could close the bridge to Anacostia Flats and keep the veterans out of downtown Washington. Glassford and many on the Washington police force were sympathetic to the veterans. The bonus would cost more than the government would take in that year. Committed to a balanced budget, Hoover asked the Senate to save the country from what he called the road to ruin.
In your hands at this moment is the answer to the question whether democracy has the capacity to act speedily enough to save itself in emergency.
Within weeks, the veterans had grown to an army of 20,000 and had lobbied hard to overcome opposition in both houses of Congress. On June 15th, they moved one step forward when the House of Representatives passed the bonus bill. The veterans began to believe they could win.
I don't think Washington really understood what had happened in the country and began to realize that something had to be done about it until you got the bonus marches coming there and descending on Washington and lobbying the Congress every day and settling into makeshift dwellings all around the Capitol. That was what brought the Depression home to government.
Now, the veterans turned out to push the bonus through the Senate. But just 2 days after the victory in the House, the Senate voted to kill the bill. The news stunned the crowd.
I remember walking down that long flight of steps in the Senate building and seeing thousands of people milling about, crowds on the steps, on the grass in front of the building. I think there was probably a sense of great confusion. What in the world do I do now? I come all the way from California or Arkansas to try to get the bonus awarded so I can feed my kids. And Senate hasn't done anything about it. What do we do now?
The veterans refused to accept defeat and hoped to force Congress to reconsider the bill. In the next few weeks, veterans continued to arrive in Washington. The numbers in the camps started to increase. As the government watched with concern, the men began to turn their temporary camps into permanent homes.
I'm just a poor ex-soldier that's broken down and blue. I fought out in a great world war for the old red, white, and blue. I left my parents and the girl I love to.
There were a lot of what I would call middle-class people. There was a sort of a leveling process as these people got together, and there was a sense of solidarity and a sense of responsibility to give a good account of themselves. There were some professional people. There were a good many women and a good many children. They tried to give little homey touches to the hovels they lived in. Some of them were built of cardboard, some of tin sheeting, some of wood. A number of them had planted little gardens.
From the earliest days of the encampments, President Hoover had secretly authorized the delivery of government supplies and medical care to the veterans. With the bonus bill defeated, Hoover wanted the veterans out of Washington. He obtained $100,000 from Congress to buy them train tickets home. With Congress scheduled to adjourn, the veterans mounted a final protest. For more than 3 days, they marched in front of the Capitol in slow, shuffling relays of tired men. The Washington press called it a death march.
All in favor, say aye.
A few minutes before midnight on the last night of the death march, Congress adjourned without passing the bonus bill. Members of both houses left through underground tunnels to avoid the veterans waiting outside.
I think the feeling began to change after Congress adjourned and the veterans stayed on, because there was no reason for them, as far as we could figure, no reason for them to stay there. They would gain nothing with the Congress out of town.
Washington authorities wanted their city back. 12 days after Congress adjourned, the district commissioners ordered police to evict the veterans from the buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue. Hundreds of angry veterans poured across the bridge from the main camp at Anacostia into downtown. President Hoover called for federal troops, but he kept the Washington police in charge and ordered General MacArthur to limit military action to the area of disturbance on Pennsylvania Avenue. Before the troops arrived, police and veterans clashed again. This time, the police opened fire. One veteran was killed. Another lay dying. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Army troops were in position behind the White House. Within the hour, two rival armies of Americans would collide on the streets of Washington.
We heard this noise coming up Pennsylvania Avenue and looked down, and here was the troops coming from Fort Myer. In front was the cavalry, followed by the little whippet tanks from World War I, and then back of them came the troop with General MacArthur and Major Eisenhower leading the way.
MacArthur's orders from the president were to surround the veterans in the abandoned buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue. In direct violation of those orders, he began to clear the entire city of the bonus army.
The Army had the tear gas. The tear gas confused the veterans. It was a feeling of frustration. You know you couldn't do anything. It was something that I'll never forget.
I happened to be near General MacArthur, and I saw him speak to a sergeant, and then I saw the sergeant collect a squad and then go down the row of ramshackle huts, and they'd throw a wad of newspaper into a corner of a hut and set that alight, and they went right down the whole row that way, and pretty soon the whole row was burning.
While MacArthur's troops mopped up downtown, 3 of his tanks held the bridge leading to Anacostia. Trapped inside the camp with the veterans were 600 of their wives and children. Twice that night, the president ordered MacArthur not to cross into Anacostia. But the general chose to ignore civilian authority. A few minutes after 11 p.m., he sent his troops across the bridge. By midnight, all of Washington could see Anacostia burning.
What had gone on reinforced my feeling that It was too bad that the richest country in the world couldn't do a better job of caring for its own people. I just thought America didn't give a very good account of itself that night.
While the ruins of Anacostia smoldered, General MacArthur reported that the veterans had intended to take over the government. Although MacArthur had violated direct orders, President Hoover took full responsibility for the eviction of the bonus army. In Albany, New York, Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic candidate for president, listened to radio reports of the rout and concluded that Hoover had already lost the election. The veterans filled the roads leading out of Washington. Now refugees from their own government, they disappeared back into the America from which they had come. But the nation had changed, and many now question some of its most fundamental assumptions about what kind of loyalty the people owed the government and about what the government owed the people in the hardest of hard times.
Hey guys, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed this lesson. When we come back here next time, we are going to take a look at what happened when Hoover was voted out of office. We get a new president. His name is Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he has a very different approach to dealing with the Great Depression. I hope you guys are staying safe. I will see you soon.